Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everyone. Last week, what did we do last week? Oh, that's what we did last week. We, read Alice in Wonderland. We finished that up and then read that, short story. I think it was called Shadows. But, this week, I wasn't particularly clear about what book we were reading, but now you all know it's time for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So, let's begin. Story of the Door. Mr. Utterson the lawyer was a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beaconed from his eye, something indeed which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in these silent symbols of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages, and though he enjoyed the theatre, he hadn't crossed the doors of one for 20 years. But he had an approved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than to reprove. "I incline to Cain's heresy," he used to say quaintly. "I let my brother go to the devil in his own way." In this character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of down-going men. And to such as these, so long as they came about his chambers, he never marked a shade of change in his demeanor. No doubt the feat was easy to Mr. Utterson, for he was undemonstrative at the best, and even his friendship seemed to be founded in a similar catholicity. Catholicity? Catholicity of good nature. It is the mark of a modest man to accept his friendly circle, ready-made from the hands of opportunity, and that was the lawyer's way. His friends were those of his own blood, or those whom he had known the longest. His affections, like ivy, were the growth of time. They implied no aptness in object. Hence, no doubt, the bond that united him to Mr. Richard Enfield, his distant kinsman, the well-known man about town. It was a nut to crack for many, what these two could see in each other, or what subject they could find in common. It was reported by those who encountered them in their Sunday walks that they said nothing, looked singularly dull, and would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a friend. For all that, the two men put the greatest store by these excursions, counted them the chief jewel of each week, and not only set aside occasions of pleasure, but even resisted the calls of business, so that they might enjoy them interrupted. It chanced on one of these rambles that their way led them down a by-street in a busy quarter of London. The street was small and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. The inhabitants were all doing well, it seemed, and all emulously hoping to do better still, and laying out the surplus of their grains and coquetry, so that the shop fronts stood along that thoroughfare with an air of invitation, like rows of smiling saleswomen. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighborhood, like a fire in a forest, and with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of passenger. 2 doors from one corner, on the left hand going east, the line was broken by the entry of a court, and just at that point a certain sinister block of building thrust forward its gable onto the street. It was 2 stories high. It showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story, and a blind forehead of discolored wall on the upper, and bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and stained. Tramps slouched under the recess and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop upon the steps. The schoolboy had tried his knife on the mouldings, and for close on a generation, No one had attempted to drive away these random visitors or to repair their ravages. Mr. Enfield and the lawyer were on the other side of the by-street, but when they came abreast of the entry, the former lifted up his cane and pointed. "Did you ever remark that door?" he asked, and when his companion had replied, it was in the affirmative. "It's connected in my mind with a very odd story." "Indeed?" said Mr. Utterson with a slight change of voice. "And what was that?" "Well, it was this way," returned Mr. Enfield. "I was coming home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, and my way lay through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps. Street after street, and all the folks asleep. Street after street, all lit up as if for a procession, and all as empty as a church, till at last I got into that state of mind when a man listens and listens, and begins to long for the sight of a policeman. All at once I saw two figures, one a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and the other a girl of maybe 8 or 10, who was running as hard as she was able down a cross street. Well, sir, the two ran into one another naturally enough at the corner, and then came the terrible part of the thing, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man, it was like a juggernaut. I gave a few hellos, took to my heels, and collared the gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a group about the screaming child. He was perfectly cool, and made no resistance, but gave me one look so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. The people who had turned out were the girl's own family, and pretty soon the doctor, for whom she had been sent, put in his appearance. Well, the child was not much the worse, more frightened, according to the sawbones, and there you might have supposed that would have been the end of it. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight, so had the child's family, which was only natural. But the doctor's case was what struck me. He was the usual cut-and-dry apothecary, of no particular age nor color, with a strong Edinburgh accent, and about as emotional as a bagpipe. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Sawbones turn sick and white with a desire to kill him. I knew what was in his mind, just as he knew what was in mine. And killing being out of the question, we did the next best. We told the man we could and would make such a scandal out of this as to make his name stink from one end of London to the other. If he had any friends or any credit, we undertook that he should lose them. And all the time we were pitching it in red hot. We were keeping the women off him as best we could, for they were as wild as harpies. I never saw such a circle of hateful faces, and there was the man in the middle, with a kind of dark, sneering coolness. He was frightened, I could see that, but he was carrying it off, really like some kind of Satan. "If you choose to make capital out of this accident," said he, "I'm naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene," said he. "Name your figure." Well, we got him up to £100 for the child's family. He would have clearly liked to stick out, but there was something about the lot of us that meant mischief, and at last he struck. The next thing was to get the money, and where do you think he carried us but to that place with the door? He whipped out a key, went in, and presently came back with a matter of £10 in gold, and a cheque for the balance on coats, drawn payable to bearer, and signed with a name I can't mention, though it's one of the points of my story, but it was a name at least very well known and often printed. The figure was stiff, but the signature was good for more than that if it was only genuine. I took the liberty of pointing out to my gentleman that the whole business looked apocryphal, and that a man does not, in real life, walk into a cellar door at 4 in the morning and come out with another man's cheque for close upon £100. But he remained quite easy and sneering. "Set your mind at rest. I'll stay with you until the bank's open and cash the cheque myself." So we all set off, the doctor and the child's father and our friend and myself, and passed the rest of the night in my chambers. And next day, when we had breakfasted, went in a body to the bank. I gave in the cheque myself, and said I had every reason to believe it was a forgery, but it wasn't a bit of it. The cheque was genuine. said Mr. Utterson. I see you feel as I do. Yes, it's a bad story. For my man was a fellow that nobody could have to do with, a really damnable man. And the person that drew the check is the very pink of the proprieties, celebrated too, and what makes it worse, one of your fellows who do what they call good. It was blackmail, I suppose, an honest man paying through the nose for some of the capers of his youth. Blackmail House is what I call the place with the door in consequence. Though even that, is far from explaining it all, he added, and with the words fell into a vein of musing. From this he was recalled by Mr. Utterson asking rather suddenly, "And you don't know if the drawer of the check lives there?" "Well, it was a likely place, isn't it?" returned Mr. Hydefield. "But I happen to have noticed his address. He lives in some square or other." "And you never asked about the place with the door?" "No, sir. I had a delicacy. I feel very strongly about putting questions. It partakes too much of the style of the day of judgment. You start a question, it's like starting a stone. You sit quietly on the top of a hill, and away the stone goes, starting others, and presently some bland old bird, the last you had thought of, is knocked on the head in his own back garden, and the family have to change their name. No, sir, I make it a rule of mine. The more it looks like a strange street, the less I ask." "It was a very good rule, too," said the lawyer. "But I've studied the place for myself," continued Mr. Hydefield. "It seems scarcely a house. There's no other door, and nobody goes in or out of that one." "Oh, there's no other door, and nobody goes in or out of that one, but once in a great while the gentleman of my adventure. There are 3 windows looking on the court in the first floor, none below. The windows always shut, but they're clean. And then there's a chimney which is generally smoking, so somebody must live there. And yet it's not so sure, for the buildings are so packed together about the court that it's hard to say where one ends and another begins." The pair walked on again for a while in silence, and then, "Enfield," said Mr. Utterson, "that's a good rule of yours." "Yes, I think it is." "But for all that, there's one point I want to ask. I want to ask the name of that man who walked over the child." "Well, I can't see what harm it would do. It was a man of the name of Hyde." What sort of man is he to see?"
"He's not easy to describe. There's something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarcely know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives the strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point. He's an extraordinary-looking man, and yet I really can blame nothing out of the way. No, sir, I can make no hand of it, and I can't describe him, and it's not for want of memory, for I declare I can see him this moment."
Mr. Utterson again walked some way in silence, and obviously under a weight of consideration. "You're sure he used a key?" he inquired at last.
"My dear sir,"
began Enfield, surprised out of himself. "Yes, I know, it must seem strange. The fact is, if I do not ask you the name of the other party, it's because I know it already. You see, Richard, your tail has gone home. If you've been inexact at any point, you'd better correct it."
"I think you might have warned me," returned the other with a touch of sullenness, "but I have been pedantically exact, as you call it. The fellow had a key, and what's more, he has it still. I saw him use it not a week ago."
Mr. Utterson sighed deeply, but said never a word, and the young man presently resumed.
"Here's another lesson to say nothing. I'm ashamed of my long tongue. Let us make a bargain never to refer to this again."
"With all my heart. I shake hands on that, Richard." Search for Mr. Hyde. That evening Mr. Utterson came home to his bachelor house in somber spirits and sat down to dinner without relish. It was It was his custom of a Sunday, when this meal was over, to sit close by the fire, a volume of some dry divinity on his reading desk, until the clock at the neighboring church rang out the hour of 12, when he would go soberly and gratefully to bed. On this night, however, as soon as the cloth was taken away, he took up a candle and went into his business room. There he opened his safe, took from the most private part of it a document endorsed with the envelope as Dr. Jekyll's will, and sat down with a clouded brow to study its contents. The will was holograph, for Mr. Utterson, though he took charge of it now that it was made, had refused to lend the least assistance in the making of it. It provided not only that, in the case of the decease of Henry Jekyll, M.D., D.C.L., LL.D., F.R.S., etc., all his possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor, Edward Hyde, but in the case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months, that said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay and free from any burden or obligation beyond the payment of a few small sums to the members of the doctor's household. The document had long been the lawyer's eyesore. It offended him, both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life, to whom the fanciful was immodest. And hitherto it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde that had swelled his indignation. Now, by a sudden turn, it was his knowledge. It was already bad enough when the name was but a name of which he could learn no more. It was worse when it began to be clothed upon with detestable attributes, and out of the shifting and substantial mist that had so long baffled his eye, there leaped a sudden, definite presentment of a fiend. "I thought it madness," he said as he replaced the obnoxious paper in the safe, "and now I begin to fear its disgrace." With that, he blew out his candle, put on a greatcoat, and set forth in the direction of Cavendish Square, that citadel of medicine, where his friend, the great Dr. Lanyon, had his house, and received his crowding patients. "If anyone knows, it'll be Lanyon," he thought. The solemn butler knew and welcomed him. He was subjected to no stage of delay, but ushered directly from the door to the dining-room, where Dr. Lanyon sat alone over his wine. This was a hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman, with a shock of hair that had gone prematurely white, and a boisterous and decided manner. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, he sprang up from his chair and welcomed him with both hands. The geniality, as was the way of the man, was somewhat theatrical to the eye, but it reposed on genuine feeling, for these two were old friends, old mates both at school and college, both thorough respecters of themselves and of each other, and what does not always follow, men who thoroughly enjoyed each other's company. After a little rambling talk, the lawyer led up to the subject which so disagreeably preoccupied his mind. "I suppose, Lanyon, you and I must be the 2 oldest friends that Henry Jekyll has."
"I wish the friends were younger," chuckled Dr. Lanyon. "But I suppose we are, and what of that? I see little of him now."
"Indeed, I thought you had a bond of common interest."
"We had, but it's more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind. And though, of course, I continue to take an interest in him, for old sake's sake, as they say, I see and have seen devilish little of the man. Such unscientific balderdash," added the doctor, flushing suddenly purple, "would have estranged Damon and Pythias." This little spirit of temper was somewhat of a relief to Mr. Utterson. They've only differed on some point of science," he thought, and being a man of no scientific passions, except in the matter of conveyancing, he even added, It's nothing worse than that." He gave his friend a few seconds to recover his composure, and then approached the question he had come to put. "Did you ever come across a protege of his, one Hyde?" "Hyde?" repeated Lanyon. "No, never heard of him, at least not since my time."
That was the amount of information the lawyer carried back with him to the great dark bed on which he tossed to and fro until the small hours of the morning began to grow large. It was a night of little ease to his toiling mind, toiling in mere darkness and besieged by questions. 6 o'clock struck on the bells of the church that was so conveniently near to Mr. Utterson's dwelling, and still he was digging at the problem. Hitherto it had touched him on the intellectual side alone, but now his imagination also was engaged, or perhaps enslaved, and as he lay and tossed in the gross darkness of the night and the curtained room, Mr. Enfield's tale went by before his mind in a scroll of lighted pictures. He would be aware of the great field of lamps in a nocturnal city, and then of the figure of a man walking swiftly, and then of a child running from the doctor's, and then these met, and then the human juggernaut trod the child down and passed on, regardless of her scream. Or else he would see the room in a rich house, where his friend lay asleep, dreaming and smiling in his dreams, and then the door of the room would be opened, the curtains of the bed plucked apart, the sleeper recalled, and lo, there would stand by his side a figure to whom power was given, and even at that dead hour he must rise and do its bidding. The figure in these two phases haunted the lawyer all night, and if at any time he dozed over, it was but to see it glide more stealthily through sleeping houses, or move the more swiftly, and still the more swiftly, even to dizziness through wider labyrinths of a lamp-lighted city, and at every street corner crush a child and leave her screaming. And still the figure had no face by which he might know it. Even in his dreams it had no face, or one that baffled him and melted before his eyes. And thus it was that there sprang up and grew space in the lawyer's mind a singularly strong, almost inordinate curiosity to behold the features of the real Mr. Hyde. If he could but once set eyes on him, he thought the mystery would lighten and perhaps roll altogether away, as was the habit of mysterious things when well examined. He might see a reason for his friend's strange preference, or bondage, call it which you please, and even for the startling clause of the will. At least it would be a face worth seeing, the face of a man who was without bowels of mercy, a face which had to bless me, the face of a man who was, goodness gracious, a face which had but to show itself to raise up, in the mind of the unimpressionable Enfield, a spirit of enduring hatred. From that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by-street of shops. In the morning before office hours, at noon when business was plenty, and time scarce, at night under the face of the fogged city moon, by all lights and at all hours of solitude or concourse, the lawyer was to be found on his chosen post. If he be Mr. Hyde, he thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. And at last his patience was rewarded. It was a fine, dry night, frost in the air, the streets as clean as a ballroom floor, the lamps unshaken by any wind, drawing a regular pattern of light and shadow. By 10 o'clock, when the shops were closed, the by-street was very solitary, and in spite of the low growl of London from all round, very silent. Small sounds carried far, domestic sounds out of the houses were clearly audible on either side of the roadway, and the rumor of the approach of any passenger preceded him by a long time. Mr. Utterson had been some minutes at his post when he was aware of an odd, light footstep drawing near. In the course of his nightly patrols he had long grown accustomed to the quaint effect with which footfalls of a single person, while he is still a great way off, suddenly spring out distinct from the vast hum and clatter of the city. And yet his attention had never been so sharply and decisively arrested, and it was with a strong, superstitious prevision of success that he withdrew into the entry of the court. The steps drew swiftly nearer and swelled out suddenly louder as they turned the end of the street. The lawyer, looking forth from the entry, could soon see what manner of a man he had to deal with. He was small and very plainly dressed, and the look of him, even at that distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. But he made straight for the door, crossing the roadway to save time, and as he came he drew a key from his pocket like one approaching home. Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. "Mr. Hyde, I think?" Mr. Hyde himself shrank back with a hissing intake of breath. But his fear was only momentary, and though he didn't look the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly enough.
"That's my name. What do you want?"
"I see you're going in. I'm an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's, Mr. Utterson of Gaunt Street. You must have heard of my name. Meeting you so conveniently, I thought you might admit me."
"You'll not find Dr. Jekyll. He's from home,"
replied Mr. Hyde, blowing in the key. And then suddenly, but still without looking up,
"How did you know me?"
On your side. Will you do me a favor?"
"With pleasure. What shall it be?"
"Will you let me see your face?" Mr. Hyde appeared to hesitate, and then, as if upon some sudden reflection, fronted about with an air of defiance, and the pair stared at each other pretty fixedly for a few seconds. "Now I shall know you again. It may be useful."
"Yes, it is as well we have met, and apropos, you should have my address."
And he gave a number of a street in Soho. Good heavens, can he too have been thinking of the will? Thought Mr. Utterson, but he kept these feelings to himself, and only grunted in acknowledgment of the address.
"And now, how did you know me?"
"By description."
"Whose description?"
"We have common friends."
"Common friends?"
echoed Mr. Hyde a little hoarsely.
"Who are they?"
Jekyll, for instance."
"He never told you?"
cried Mr. Hyde with a flush of anger.
"I did not think you would have lied."
"Come now, that's not fitting language." The other snarled aloud into a savage laugh, and the next moment, with extraordinary quickness, he'd unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. The lawyer stood a while when Mr. Hyde had left him, the picture of disquietude. Then he began to slowly mount the street, pausing every step or two and putting his hand to his brow, like a man in mental perplexity. The one problem he was thus debating as he walked was of a sort that was rarely solved. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He'd borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, and he spoke with a husky, whispering, and somewhat broken voice. All these were points against him, but not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing, and fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him. There must be something else. There is something more, if I could find a name for it. Heavens bless me, the man seems hardly human. Something troglodytic, shall we say? Or can it be the old story of Dr. Fell? Is it the mere radiance of a foul soul that dust transpires through, and transfigures its clay continent? The last, I think. Oh, for my poor old Harry Jekyll. If I ever read Satan's signature upon a face, it's on that of your new friend. Round the corner from the by-street there was a square of ancient, handsome houses, now for the most part decayed from their high estate, and let in flats and chambers to all sorts and conditions of men. Map engravers, architects, shady lawyers, agents of obscure enterprises. However, one house, second from this corner, was still occupied entire, and at the door of this, which wore a great air of wealth and comfort, though it was now plunged in darkness except for the fanlight, Mr. Utterson stopped and looked. A well-dressed, elderly servant opened the door. Is Dr. Jekyll at home, Poole?" asked the lawyer. "I will see, Mr. Utterson," said Poole, admitting the visitor as he spoke, into a large, low-roofed, comfortable hall paved with flags, warmed after the fashion of a country house by a bright open fire, and furnished with costly cabinets of oak. "Will you wait here by the fire, sir, or shall I give you a light in the dining-room?" "Here, thank you," said the lawyer, and he drew near and leaned on the tall fender. This hall, in which he was now left alone, was a pet fancy of his friend the doctor's. and Utterson himself was wont to speak of it as the pleasantest room in London. But tonight there was a shudder in his blood. The face of Hyde sat heavy in his memory, and he felt, what was rare with him, a nausea and distaste of life. And in the gloom of his spirits he seemed to read a menace in the flickering of the firelight on the polished cabinets, and the uneasy starting of the shadow on the roof. He was ashamed of his relief when Poole presently returned to announce that Dr. Jekyll had gone out. "I saw Mr. Hyde go in by that old dissecting room, Poole. Is that right, when Dr. Jekyll is from home?"
Quite right, Mr. Edison, sir. Mr. Hyde has a key."
"Your master seems to repose a great deal of trust in that young man, Poole," resumed the other musingly.
"Yes, sir, he does indeed. We have all orders to obey him."
"I do not think I ever met Mr. Hyde."
Oh, dear no, sir, he never dines here," replied the butler. "Indeed, we see very little of him on this side of the house. He mostly comes and goes by the laboratory."
"Well, good night, Poole."
"Good night, Mr. Utterson."
And the lawyer set out homeward with a very heavy heart. "Poor Henry Jekyll," he thought. "My mind misgives me. He is in deep waters. He was wild when he was young, a long while ago to be sure, but there in the love, the heavens, there's no statute of limitations. It must be that, the ghost of some old sin, cancer of some concealed disgrace, punishment coming, periclodo, years after the memory is forgotten and self-love condoned the fault." And the lawyer, scared by the thought, brooded a while on his own past, groping in all the corners of his memory, lest by chance some jack-in-the-box of some old iniquity should leap to light there. His past was fairly blameless. Few men could read the rolls of their life with less apprehension, and yet he was humbled to the dust by the many ill things he had done, and raised up again into a sober and fearful gratitude by the many he had come so near to doing, yet avoided. And then by a return on his former subject he conceived a spark of hope. "This Master Hyde, if he was studied," he thought, "must have secrets of his own, dark secrets by the look of him, secrets compared to which poor Jekyll's worst must look like sunshine. Things cannot continue as they are. It turns me cold to think of this creature stalking like a thief to Harry's bedside. Poor Harry, what awakening! And the danger of it, for if this Hyde suspects the existence of the will, he may grow impatient to inherit. I must put my shoulders to the wheel, if Jekyll will but let me," he added, "if Jekyll will only let me." For once more he saw before his mind's eye, as clear as transparency, the strange clauses of the will. Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease. A fortnight later, by excellent good fortune, the doctor gave one of his pleasant dinners to some 5 or 6 old cronies, all intelligent, reputable men, and all judges of good wine. And Mr. Utterson so contrived that he remained behind after the others had departed. This was no new arrangement, but a thing that had befallen many scores of times. Where Utterson was liked, he was liked well. Hosts loved to detain the dry lawyer. When the light-hearted and loose-tongued had already their foot on the threshold, they liked to sit a while in his unobtrusive company, practising for solitude, sobering their minds in the man's rich silence, after the expense and strain of gaiety. To this rule Dr. Jekyll was no exception, and as he now sat on the opposite side of the fire, a large, well-made, smooth-faced man of 50, with something of a stylish cast perhaps, but every mark of capacity and kindness, you could see by his looks that he cherished for Mr. Utterson a sincere and warm affection. "I've been wanting to speak to you, Jekyll," began the latter. "You know that will of yours?" A close observer might have gathered that the topic was distasteful, but the doctor carried it off gaily.
"My poor Utterson, you're unfortunate in such a client. I never saw a man so distressed as you were by my will, unless it were that the hide-bound pedant Lanyon at what he called my scientific heresies. Oh, I know he's a good fellow, you needn't frown. An excellent fellow, and I always mean to see more of him. But, you see, I find him a hidebound pedant for all that, an ignorant, blatant pedant. I was never more disappointed in any man than Lanyon. Really unfortunate stuff. You know I never approved of it, pursued Utterson, ruthlessly disregarding the fresh topic. My will? Yes, certainly I know that, said the doctor, a trifle sharply. You've told me so. Well, I'll tell you again, continued the lawyer. I've been learning something of young Hyde. The large, handsome face of Dr. Jekyll grew pale to the very lips, and there came a darkness about his eyes. I do not care to hear more. This is a matter I thought we had agreed to drop. What I heard was abominable. It can make no change. You do not understand my position, returned the doctor with a certain incoherency of manner. I'm painfully situated, Utterson. My position is a very strange one indeed. It's one of those affairs that cannot be mended by talking. Jekyll, you know me. I am a man to be trusted. Make a clean breast of this in confidence. I make no doubt I can get you out of it. My good Utterson, this is very good of you. This is downright good of you. I must say, I cannot find words to thank you in. I believe you fully. I would trust you before any man alive, before myself, if I could make the choice. But indeed it isn't what you fancy. It's not as bad as all that. And just to put your good heart at rest, I will tell you one thing. The moment I choose, I can be rid of Mr. Hyde. I give you my hand upon that, and I thank you again and again. And I will just add one little word, Utterson, that I'm sure you'll take in good part. This is a private matter, and I beg you, let it sleep. Utterson reflected a little at this, and he stared into the fire. I have no doubt you are perfectly right, he said at last, getting to his feet. Well, but since we have touched upon this business, and for the last time, I hope, continued the doctor, there is one point I should like you to understand. I have a really great interest in poor Hyde. I know you've seen him, he told me so, and I fear he was rude. But I do sincerely take a great, very great, in fact, interest in that young man, and if I am taken away, Utterson, I wish you to promise me that you will bear with him and get his rights for him. I think you would, if you knew all, and it would be a weight off my mind, if you would promise. I can't pretend that I shall ever like him. I don't ask that, pleaded Jekyll, laying his hand upon the other's arm. I only ask for justice. I only ask for you to help him for my sake, shall we say, when I'm no longer here. Utterson heaved an irrepressible sigh. Well, I promise. The Carew murder case. Nearly a year later, in the month of October 18XX, London was startled by a crime of singular ferocity, and rendered all the more notable by the high position of the victim. The details were few and startling. A maid-servant living alone in a house not far from the river had gone upstairs to bed about 11. Although a fog had rolled over the city in the small hours, the early part of the night was cloudless, and the lane, which the maid's window overlooked, was brightly lit by the full moon. It seemed she was romantically given, for she sat down upon her box, which stood immediately under the window, and fell into a dream of musing. Never, she used to say with streaming tears when she narrated that experience, never had she felt more at peace with all men or thought more kindly of the world. And as she so sat, she became aware of an aged, beautiful gentleman with white hair drawing near along the lane, and advancing to meet him another and very small gentleman, to whom at first she paid less attention. When they had come within speech, which was just under the maid's eyes, the older man bowed and accosted the other with a very petty manner of politeness,
It did not seem as if the subject of his address were of great importance. Indeed, from his pointing, it sometimes appeared as if he were only inquiring this way. But the moon shone on his face as he spoke, and the girl was pleased to watch it. It seemed to breathe such an innocent and old-world kindness of disposition, yet with something high, too, as of a well-founded self-content. Presently her eye wandered to the other, and she was surprised to recognize him in a certain Mr. Hyde, who had once visited her master, and for whom she had conceived a dislike. He had in his hand a heavy cane, which he was trifling, but he answered never a word, and seemed to listen with an ill-contained impatience. And then all of a sudden he broke out in a great flame of anger, stamping with his foot, brandishing the cane, and carrying on, as the maid described it, like a madman. The old gentleman took a step back, with the air of one very much surprised and a trifle hurt, and at that Mr. Hyde broke out of all bounds and clubbed him to the earth. And next moment, with an ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot, and hailing down a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered, and the body jumped upon the roadway. At the horror of these sights and sounds, the maid fainted. And it was 2 o'clock when she came to herself and called the police. The murderer was gone long ago, but there lay his victim But there lay his victim in the middle of the lane, incredibly mangled. The stick with which the deed had been done, although it was of some rare and tough and very heavy wood, had broken in the middle under the stress of this insensate cruelty, and one splintered half had rolled in the neighboring gutter. The other, without doubt, had been carried away by the murderer. A purse and gold watch were found upon the victim, but no cards or papers, except a sealed and stamped envelope, which he had been probably carrying to the post, and which bore the name and address of Mr. Utterson. This was brought to the lawyer the next morning, before he was out of bed, and he had no sooner seen it and been told the circumstances than shot out a solemn lip. "I shall say nothing till I've seen the body," said he. "This may be very serious. Have the kindness to wait while I dress." And with the same grave countenance, he hurried through his breakfast and drove to the police station, whither the body had been carried. As soon as he came into the cell, he nodded. "Yes, I recognize him. I'm sorry to say that this is Sir Danvers Carew."
Good heavens, sir. Is it possible?"
And the next moment his eye lighted up with professional ambition. "This will make a great deal of noise, and perhaps you can help us to the man," exclaimed the officer. And he briefly narrated what the maid had seen, and showed the broken stick. Mr. Utterson had already quailed at the name of Hyde, but when the stick was laid before him, he could doubt no longer. Broken and battered as it was, he recognized it for the one that he himself presented many years before to Henry Jekyll. "Is this Mr. Hyde a person of small stature?"
"Particularly small and particularly wicked-looking is what the maid called him."
Mr. Utterson reflected at this, and then raised his head. "If you will come with me in my cab, I think I can take you to his home." It was by this time about 9 in the morning, and the first fog of the season. A great chocolate-colored pall lowered over the heavens, but the wind was continually charging and rounding these embattled vapors, so that as the cab crawled from street to street, Mr. Utterson beheld a marvelous number of degrees and hues of twilight. For here it would be dark like the back end of evening, and there would be a glow of rich lurid brown, like the light of some strange conflagration, and here for a moment the fog would be quite broken up, and a haggard shaft of daylight would glance in between the swirling wreaths. The dismal quarter of Soho, seen under these changing glimpses, with its muddy ways and slatternly passengers, and its lamps which had never been extinguished or had been kindled afresh to combat this mournful re-invasion of darkness, seemed in the lawyer's eyes like a district of some city in a nightmare. The thoughts of his mind, besides, were of the gloomiest dye, and when he glanced at the companion of his drive, he was conscious of some touch of that terror of the law and the law's officers which may at times assail even the most honest. As the cab drew up before the address indicated, the fog lifted a little and showed him a dingy street. A gin palace, a low French eating house, a shop for the retail of penny numbers and two-penny salads, many ragged children huddled in the doorways, and many women, as of many different nationalities, passing out, key in hand, to have a morning glass. And the next moment the fog settled down again upon that part, as brown as umber, and cut him off from his blackguardly surroundings. This was the home of Henry Jekyll's favourite, of a man who was heir to 250,000 sterling. An ivory-faced and silvery-haired old woman opened the door. She had an evil face, smoothed by hypocrisy, but her manners were excellent. Yes, she said, this was Mr. Hyde's, but he wasn't at home. He'd been in that night very late, but he'd gone away again in less than an hour. There was nothing strange in that. His habits were very irregular, and he was often absent. For instance, it was nearly 2 months since she'd seen him till yesterday. Very well, then, we wish to see his rooms, said the lawyer, and when the woman began to declare it was impossible, I had better tell you who this person is, he added. This is Inspector Newcomen of Scotland Yard. A flash of odious joy appeared upon the woman's face. Oh, he's in trouble. Oh, said she, he's in trouble. What's he done? Mr. Utterson and the inspector exchanged glances at her tone.
He doesn't seem a very popular character, observed the latter.
And now, my good woman, let me and this gentleman have a look about us, shall we? In the whole extent of the house, which, but for the old woman, remained otherwise empty, Mr. Hyde had only used a couple of rooms, but these were furnished with luxury and good taste. A closet was filled with wine. The plate was of silver, the napery elegant. A good picture hung upon the walls, a gift, as Utterson supposed, from Henry Jekyll, who was much of a connoisseur, and the carpets were of many piles and agreeable in colour. All right, question of the day. What's napery mean? No, I don't need to highlight that line. What does napery mean? No, go back. Napery, what do you mean? Napery, household linen, especially tablecloths and napkins. So the table setting is very elegant. He's very much a man of taste, or at least has had the place furnished by a man of taste. At this moment, however, the rooms bore every mark of having been recently and hurriedly ransacked. Clothes lay about the floor, with their pockets inside out. Lock-fast drawers stood open, and on the hearth there lay a pile of grey ashes, as though many papers had been burned. From these embers the inspector disinterred the butt end of a green cheque-book, which had resisted the action of the fire, and the other half of the stick was found behind the door, and as this clinched his suspicions, the officer declared himself delighted. A visit to the bank, where several £1,000 were found to be lying to the murderer's credit, completed his gratification.
You may depend upon it, sir. I have him in my hand. He must have lost his head, or he never would have left the stick, or, above all, burned his cheque-book. Why, money's life to the man. We have nothing to do but to wait for him at the bank and get out the handbills.
This last, however, was not so easy of an accomplishment, for Mr. Hyde had numbered few familiars. Even the master of the servant maid had only seen him twice. His family could nowhere be traced. He'd never been photographed, and the few who could describe him differed wildly, as common observers often do. Only on one point were they agreed, and that was the haunting sense of unexpressed deformity with which the fugitive impressed his beholders. Incident of the letter. It was late in the afternoon when Mr. Utterson found his way to Dr. Jekyll's door, where he was at once admitted by Poole, and carried down by the kitchen offices and across a yard, which had once been a garden. Let's start this line over. It wasn't flowing very well with all those unfortunate interruptions. It was late in the afternoon when Mr. Utterson found his way to Dr. Jekyll's door, where he was at once admitted by Poole and carried down by the kitchen offices, and across a yard which had once been a garden, to the building which was indifferently known as the laboratory, or perhaps by the dissecting room. The doctor bought the house. Blah, blah, blah. The doctor bought the house from the heirs of a celebrated surgeon, and his own taste being rather chemical than anatomical, had changed the destination of the block at the bottom of the garden. It was the first time that the lawyer had been received in that part of his friend's quarters, and he eyed the dingy, windowless structure with curiosity, and gazed round with a distasteful sense of strangeness as he crossed the theatre, once crowded with eager students and now lying gaunt and silent, the tables laden with chemical apparatus, the floor strewn with crates and littered with packing straw, and the light falling dimly through the foggy cupola. At the further end, a flight of stairs mounted to a door covered with red baize, and through this Mr. Utterson was at last received into the doctor's cabinet. It was a large room fitted round with glass presses, furnished, among other things, with a cheval glass and a business table, and looking out upon the court by 3 dusty windows, barred with iron. The fire burned in the grate, a lamp was set lighted on the chimney shelf, and for even in the houses the fog began to lie thickly, and there, up close to the warmth, sat Dr. Jekyll, looking deathly sick. He didn't rise to meet his visitor, but held out a cold hand and bade him welcome in a changed voice. "And now," said Mr. Utterson, as soon as Poole had left them, "you have heard the news?" The doctor shuddered.
They were crying it in the square. I heard them in my dining room."
"One word. Rather, this is the lawyer. One word. Carew was my client, but so are you, and I want to know what I'm doing. You've not been mad enough to hide this fellow?"
"Utterson, I swear I'll never set eyes on him again. I bind my honor to you that I'm done with him in this world. It's all at an end, and indeed he doesn't want my help. You don't know him as I do. He's safe, quite safe. Mark my words, he'll never more be heard of."
The lawyer listened gloomily. He didn't like his friend's feverish manner. "You seem pretty sure of him, and for your sake I hope you may be right. If it came to a trial, your name might appear."
"I'm quite sure of him. I have grounds for certainty that I cannot share with anyone. But there is one thing on which you may advise me. I've received a letter, and I'm at a loss whether I should show it to the police. I should like to leave it in your hands, Utterson. You would judge wisely, I'm sure. I have so great a trust in you."
"You fear, I suppose, that it might lead to his detection?"
"No, I cannot say I care what becomes of Hyde. I'm quite done with him. I was thinking of my own character, which this hateful business has rather exposed."
Utterson ruminated a while on this. He was surprised at his friend's selfishness, and yet relieved by it. "Well, let me see the letter." The letter was written in an odd, upright hand, and signed Edward Hyde, and it signified, briefly enough, that the writer's benefactor, Dr. Jekyll, whom he had long so unworthily repaid for 1,000 generosities, need labour under no alarm for his safety, as he had means of an escape on which he placed a sure dependence. The lawyer liked this letter well enough. It put a better colour on the intimacy than he had looked for, and he blamed himself for some of those past suspicions. "Have you the envelope?"
"I burned it before I thought I was about. But it bore no postmark. The note was handed in."
"Shall I keep this and sleep upon it?"
"I wish you to judge for me entirely. I have lost confidence in myself."
"Well, I shall consider. And now one word more. It was Hyde who dictated the terms in your will about that disappearance?" The doctor seemed seized with a qualm of faintness. He shut his mouth tight and nodded. I knew it. He meant to murder you. You had a fine escape."
"I have had what is far more to the purpose," returned the doctor solemnly. "I've had a lesson. Oh, Utterson, what a lesson I've had." And he covered his face for a moment with his hands. On his way out, the lawyer stopped and had a word or two with Poole.
"By the by, there was a letter handed in today. What was the messenger like?" But Poole was positive nothing had come by except the post, and only circulars by that. This news sent off the visitor with his fears renewed. Plainly the letter had come by the laboratory door. Possibly, indeed, it had been written in the cabinet, and if that were so, it must be differently judged, and handled with more caution. The newsboys, as he went, were crying themselves hoarse along the footways. "Special edition, shocking murder of an MP." That was the funeral oration of one friend and client, and he couldn't help a certain apprehension lest the good name of another should be sucked down in the eddy of the scandal. It was at least a ticklish decision that he had to make, and self-reliant as he was by habit, he began to cherish a longing for advice. It was not to be had directly, but perhaps, he thought, it might be fished for. Presently after, he had sat on one side of his own hearth, with Mr. Guest, his head clerk, upon the other, and midway between, at a nicely calculated distance from the fire, a bottle of particular old wine that had long dwelt unsunned in the foundations of his house. The fog still slept on the wing above the drowned city, where the lamps glimmered like carbuncles, and through the muffle and smother of these fallen clouds, the procession of the town's life was still rolling in through the great arteries with a sound as of a mighty wind. But the room was aglow with firelight. In the bottle the acids were long ago resolved. The imperial dye had softened with time, and as colors grow richer in stained windows, the glow of hot autumn afternoons on hillside vineyards was ready to be set free and to disperse the fogs of London. Insensibly the lawyer melted. There was no man from whom he kept fewer secrets than Mr. Guest, and he was not always sure that he kept as many as he meant. Guest had often been on business to the doctor's. He knew Poole. He could scarce have failed to hear of Mr. Hyde's familiarity about the house. He might draw conclusions. Was it not as well, then, that he should see a letter which put that mystery to right? And above all, since Guest, being a great student and critic of handwriting, would consider the step natural and obliging? The clerk, besides, was a man of counsel. He could scarce read such a strange document without dropping a remark, and by that remark Mr. Utterson might shape his future course. "This is a sad business about Mr. Danvers." Rather, this is the lawyer. "This is a sad business about Sir Danvers."
"Yes, sir, indeed. It has elicited a great deal of public feeling. The man, of course, was mad."
"I should like to hear your views on that. I have a document here in his handwriting. It's between ourselves, for I scarce know what to do about it. It's an ugly business at the best, but there it is, quite in your way, a murderer's autograph."
Guest's eyes brightened, and he sat down at once and studied it with passion.
"No, sir, not mad, but it is an odd hand."
"And by all accounts a very odd writer," added the lawyer.
Just then the servant entered with a note.
"Is that from Dr. Jekyll, sir?"
inquired the clerk.
"I thought I knew his writing. Anything private, Mr. Utterson?"
"Only an invitation to dinner. Why? Do you wish to see it?"
"One moment, I thank you, sir."
And the clerk laid the two sheets of paper alongside and sedulously compared their contents.
"Thank you, sir,"
he said at last, returning both.
"It's a very interesting autograph."
There was a pause, during which Mr. Utterson struggled with himself.
"Why did you compare them, Guest?"
Well, sir, there's a rather singular resemblance. The two hands are in many points identical, only differently sloped.
That's rather quaint.
It is, as you say, rather quaint.
I wouldn't speak of this note, you know.
No, sir, but I understand.
But no sooner was Mr. Utterson alone that night than he locked the note into his safe, where it reposed from that time forward. What? Henry Jekyll forged a murderer? And his blood ran cold in his veins. Incident of Dr. Lanyon. Time ran on. Thousands of pounds were offered in reward for the death of Sir Danvers was resented as a public injury, but Mr. Hyde had disappeared out of the ken of the police, as though he had never existed. Much of his past was Much of his past was unearthed indeed, and all disreputable. Tales came out of the man's cruelty, at once so callous and violent, of his vile life, of his strange associates, of the hatred that seemed to have surrounded his career. But of his present whereabouts there was not a whisper. From the time he'd left the house in Soho on the morning of the murder, he was simply blotted out. And gradually, as time grew on, Mr. Utterson began to recover from the hotness of his alarm, and he began to grow more at quiet with himself. The death of Sir Danvers was, to his way of thinking, more than paid for by the disappearance of Mr. Hyde. Now that the evil influence had gone, a new life began to Dr. Jekyll. He came out of his seclusion, renewed relations with his friends, and became once more their familiar guest and entertainer. And while he'd always been known for charities, he was now no less distinguished for religion. He was busy, he was much in the open air, he did good. His face seemed to open and brighten, as if with an inward consciousness of service, and for more than 2 months the doctor was at peace. On the 8th of January, Utterson had dined at the doctor's with a small party. Lanyon had been there, and the face of the host had looked from one to the other as in the old days when the trio were inseparable friends. On the 12th and again on the 14th, the door was shut against the lawyer. The doctor... what was this waitstaff person's voice? The doctor was confined to the house and saw no one. On the 15th he tried again, and was again refused, and having now been used for the last 2 months to see his friend almost daily, he found this return of solitude to weigh upon his spirits. The 5th night he had in guest to dine with him, and the 6th he betook himself to Dr. Lanyon's. There at least he was not denied admittance, but when he came in he was shocked by the change that had taken place in the doctor's appearance. He had his death warrant written legibly upon his face. The rosy man had grown pale. His flesh, not an L there at all. The rosy man had grown pale. His flesh had fallen away. He was visibly balder and older. And yet it was not so much these tokens of a swift physical decay that arrested the lawyer's notice, as a look in the eye and quality of manner that seemed to testify to some deep-seated terror of the mind. It was unlikely that the doctor should fear death, and yet that was what Utterson was tempted to suspect. Yes, he is a doctor. He must know his own state, and that his days are counted. The knowledge is simply more than he can bear, I suppose. And yet, when Utterson remarked on this ill look, it was with an air of great firmness that Lanyon declared himself a doomed man.
I've had a shock, and I shall never recover. It's a question of weeks.
Well, life has been pleasant. I liked it. Yes, sir, I used to like it. I sometimes think if we knew all, we should be more glad to get away. Jekyll is ill too. Have you seen him? But Lanyon's face changed, and he held up a trembling hand.
I wish to see or hear no more of Dr. Jekyll. I'm quite done with that person, and I beg that you will spare me any allusion to one I regard as, well, dead,
said Mr. Utterson, and then after a considerable pause, "Can't I do anything? We are 3 very old friends, Leighton. We shall not live to make old any others, you know."
"Nothing can be done. Ask himself."
"He won't see me."
"I'm not surprised at that. Some day, Utterson, after I'm dead, you may perhaps come to learn the right and wrong of this. I cannot tell you. In the meantime, if you can sit and talk with me of other things, for heaven's sake, stay and do so. But if you cannot keep clear of this accursed topic, then, dear heavens, go. I cannot bear it."
As soon as he got home, Utterson sat down and wrote to Jekyll, complaining of his exclusion from the house, and asking the cause of this unhappy break with Lanyon. And the next day brought him a long answer, often very pathetically worded, and sometimes darkly mysterious in drift. The quarrel with Lanyon was incurable.
I do not blame our old friend," Jekyll wrote, "but I share his view that we must never meet. I mean from henceforth to live a life of extreme seclusion. You must not be surprised, nor must you doubt my friendship, if my door is often shut even to you. You must suffer me to go my own dark way. I've brought on myself a punishment and a danger that I cannot name. If I am the chief of sinners, I am the chief of sufferers also. I could not think that this earth contained a place for sufferings and terrors so unmanning. And you can do but one thing, Utterson, to lighten this destiny, and that is to respect my silence."
Utterson was amazed. The dark influence of Hyde had been withdrawn. The doctor had returned to his old tasks and amenities. A week ago the prospect had smiled with every promise of a cheerful and honored age. And now, in a moment, friendship and peace of mind and the whole tenor of life were wrecked. So great and unprepared a change pointed to madness, but in view of Lanyon's manner and words, there must lie for it some deeper ground. A week afterwards, Dr. Lanyon took to his bed, and in something less than a fortnight he had died. The night after the funeral, at which he had been sadly affected, Utterson locked the door of his business room, and, sitting there by the light of a melancholy candle, drew out and set before him an envelope addressed by hand, and sealed with the seal of his dead friend. "Private, for the hands of G. J. Utterson alone, and in case of his predeceased to be destroyed unread," so it was emphatically superscribed, and the lawyer dreaded to behold the contents. "I've buried another friend today," he thought. "What if this should cost me another?" And then he condemned the fear that as disloyalty, and broke the seal. Within there was another enclosure, likewise sealed, and marked upon the cover as not to be opened till the death or disappearance of Dr. Henry Jekyll. Utterson couldn't trust his eyes. Yes, it was the disappearance. Here again, as in the Mad, which he had long ago restored to its author, here again was the idea of a disappearance, and the name of Henry Jekyll bracketed. But in the will that idea had sprung from the sinister suggestion of the man Hyde. It was set there with a purpose all too plain and horrible. Written by the hand of Lanyon, what should it mean? A great curiosity came on to the trustee to disregard the prohibition and dive at once to the bottom of these mysteries, but professional honor and faith to his dead friend were stringent obligations, and the packet slept in the inmost corner of his private safe. It's certainly one thing to mortify curiosity, and another to conquer it, and it may be doubted if, from that day forth, Utterson desired the society of his surviving friend with the same eagerness. He thought of him kindly, but his thoughts were disquieted and fearful. He went to call, indeed, but he was perhaps relieved to be not denied admittance. Perhaps in his heart he preferred to speak with Poole upon the doorstep, and surrounded by the air and sounds of the open city, rather than to be admitted into that house of voluntary bondage, and to sit and speak with its inscrutable recluse. Poole had, indeed, no very pleasant news to communicate. The doctor, it appeared, now more than ever, confined himself to the cabinet over the laboratory, where he would sometimes even sleep. He was out of spirits, he'd grown very silent, he didn't read. It seemed as if he had something on his mind. Utterson became so used to the unvarying character of these reports that he fell off little by little in the frequency of his visits. Incident at the window. It chanced on Sunday, when Mr. Utterson was on his usual walk with Mr. Enfield, that their way lay once again upon through the by-street, and that when they came in front of the door both stopped to gaze on it.
"Well," said Enfield, "that story's at an end, at least. We shall never see more of Mr. Hyde."
"I should hope not. Did I ever tell you that once I saw him and shared your feeling of repulsion?"
"It was impossible to do the one without the other," returned Enfield. "And by the way, what a rear end you must have thought me to not know that this was a back way to Dr. Jekyll's. It was partly your own fault that I found it out, even when I did."
"So you found it, did you? But that may be so. But if that be so, we may step into the court and take a look at the windows. To tell you the truth, I'm uneasy about poor Jekyll, and even outside I feel as if the presence of a friend might do him good." The court was very cool and a little damp, and full of premature twilight, although the sky, high up overhead, was still bright with sunset. The middle one of the three windows was halfway open, and standing close beside it, taking the air with an infinite sadness of mien, like some disconsolate prisoner, Utterson saw Dr. Jekyll. "What, Jekyll? I trust you're better."
"I'm very low, Utterson," replied the doctor drearily. "Very low. It will not last long, thank heaven."
"You stay too much indoors. You should be out whipping up the circulation like Mr. Enfield and myself. Come now, get your hat and take a quick turn with us."
"You're very good. I should like to very much, but no. It's quite impossible. I dare not. But indeed, Utterson, I'm very glad to see you. This is really a great pleasure. I would ask you and Mr. Enfield up, but the place really isn't fit."
"Why, then the best thing we can do is stay down here and speak with you from where we are."
"That is just what I was about to venture to propose," returned the doctor, with a smile.
But his words were hardly uttered before the smile struck out of his face, and was succeeded by an expression of such abject terror and despair that it froze the very blood of the two gentlemen below. They saw it but for a glimpse, for the window was instantly thrust down. But that glimpse had been sufficient, and they turned and left the court without a word. In silence, too, they traversed the by-street, and it was not until they had come upon a neighboring thoroughfare, where even upon a Sunday there were still some stirrings of life, that Mr. Utterson at last turned and looked at his companion. They were both pale, and there was an answering horror in their eyes. "Heaven forgive us," said Mr. Utterson. But Mr. Enfield only nodded his head, very seriously, and walked on once more in silence. The last night. Mr. Utterson was sitting by his fireside one evening, after dinner, when he was surprised to receive a visit from Poole. Bless me, Poole, what brings you here? He cried, and then, taking a second look at him, what ails you? Is the doctor ill?
Mr. Utterson, there is something wrong.
Take a seat. Here is a glass of wine for you. Take your time to tell me plainly what you want.
You know the doctor's ways, sir, how he shuts himself up. Well, he's shut up again in the cabinet, and I don't like it, sir. I wish I may die if I like it. Mr. Utterson, sir, I'm afraid.
Now, my good man, be explicit. What are you afraid of?
I've been afraid for about a week, returned Poole, doggedly disregarding the question, and I can bear it no more.
The man's appearance amply bore out his words. His manner was definitely altered for the worst, and except for the moment when he had first announced his terror, he had not once looked the lawyer in the face. Even now he sat with a glass of wine, untasted, on his knee, and his eyes directed to a corner of the floor.
I can bear it no more.
Come, I see you have some good reason, Poole. There's seriously something amiss. Try to tell me what it is.
I think there's been foul play.
Foul play? Cried the lawyer, a good deal frightened and rather inclined to be irritated in consequence. What foul play? What does the man mean?
I daren't say, sir, but will you come along with me and see for yourself?
Mr. Utterson's only answer was to rise and get his hat and greatcoat, but he observed with wonder the greatness of relief that appeared upon the butler's face, and perhaps with no less that the wine was still untasted when he set it down to follow. It was a wild, cold, seasonable night of March, with a pale moon lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her, and flying wrack of the most diaphanous and lawny texture. Okay, first of all, flying wrack, is that what I think it means? Rack, a framework typically with rail... No. Especially... no, this is... I'm looking for... Historical... Where's the thing? Okay, this is giving me... Oh, rack, cause extreme pain, turns with guilt. This isn't what I'm finding. Never mind. Anyway, the wind made talking difficult, and flecked the blood into the face. It seemed to have swept the streets unusually bare of passengers. Besides, for Mr. Utterson had thought he'd never seen that part of London so deserted. He could have wished it otherwise. Never in his life had he been conscious of so sharp a wish to see and touch his fellow creatures, for struggle as he might, there was borne in upon his mind a crushing anticipation of calamity. The square, when they got there, was full of wind and dust, and the thin trees in the garden were lashing themselves along the railing. Poole, who had kept all the way, a pace or two ahead, now pulled up in the middle of the pavement, and in spite of the biting weather, took off his hat and mopped his brow with a red pocket handkerchief. But for all the hurry of his coming, these were not the dews of exertion he wiped away, but the moisture of some strangling anguish. For his face was white, and his voice, when he spoke, was harsh and broken.
Well, sir, here we are, and heaven grant there be nothing wrong.
I agree, Poole. Thereupon the servant knocked in a very guarded manner. The door was opened on the chain, and a voice asked from within, "Is that you, Poole?"
"It's all right. Open the door."
The hall, when they entered it, was brightly lit up. The fire was built high, and about the hearth the whole of the servants, men and women, stood huddled together like a flock of sheep. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, the housemaid broke into hysterical whimpering, and the cook cried out, It's Mr.
Utterson!"
ran forward as if to take him in her arms. What? Are you all here?" said the lawyer peevishly. "Very irregular. Quite unseemly. Your master would be far from pleased."
They're all afraid.
A dark silence followed. No one protested. Only the maid lifted her voice and now wept loudly.
Hold your tongue,
Poole said to her, with a ferocity of accent that testified to his own jangled nerves. And indeed, when the girl had so suddenly raised the note of her lamentation, they had all started and turned toward the inner door, with faces of dreadful expectation.
And now,
Continued the butler, addressing the knife boy,
reach me a candle and we'll get this through hands at once.
and then he begged Mr. Utterson to follow him, and led the way to the back garden.
Now, sir, you come as gently as you can. I want you to hear, and I don't want you to be heard. And see here, sir, if by any chance he was to ask you in, don't go.
Mr. Utterson's nerves, at this unlooked-for termination, gave a jerk that nearly threw him from his balance. But he recollected his courage, and followed the butler into the laboratory building through the surgical theatre, with its lumber of crates and bottles, to the foot of the stair. Here Poole motioned him to stand on one side and listen, while he himself, setting down the candle and making a great and obvious call in his resolution, mounted the steps and knocked with a somewhat uncertain hand on the red baize of the cabinet door.
Mr. Utterson, sir, asking to see you,
he called, and even as he did so, once more violently signed to the lawyer to give ear. A voice answered from within.
Tell him I cannot see anyone. Thank you, sir,
said Poole, with a note of something like triumph in his voice, and, taking up his candle, he led Mr. Utterson back across the yard and into the great kitchen, where the fire was out and the beetles were leaping on the floor.
Sir,
he said, looking Mr. Utterson in the eyes,
was that my master's voice?
It seemed much changed, replied the lawyer, very pale, but giving look for look.
Changed? Well, I should think so. Have I been 20 years in this man's house to be deceived about his voice? No, sir. Master's been made away with. He was made away with 8 days ago, when we heard him cry out upon the name of God. And who's in there instead of him, and why it stays there, is a thing that cries to heaven, Mr. Utterson.
That's a very strange tale, Poole. This is a rather wild tale, my man, said Mr. Utterson, biting at his finger. Suppose it were as you suppose. Supposing Dr. Jekyll to have been, well, murdered, what could induce the murderer to stay? That won't hold water. It doesn't commend itself to reason.
Well, Mr. Utterson, you're a hard man to satisfy, but I'll do it yet. All this last week, you must know, him or it or whatever that lives in that cabinet has been crying night and day for some sort of medicine, and cannot get it to his mind. It was sometimes his way, the master's that is, to write orders on a sheet of paper and throw it on the stair. We've had nothing else this week back, nothing but papers and a closed door, and the very meals left there to be smuggled in when nobody was looking. Well, sir, every day and twice and thrice on the same day, there have been orders and complaints, and I have been sent flying to all the wholesale chemists in town. Every time I brought the stuff back, there would be another paper telling me to return it, because it was not pure, and another order to a different firm. This drug is wanted bitter bad, sir. Whatever for.
Have you any of these papers? Poe felt in his pocket and handed out a crumpled note, which the lawyer, bending nearer to the candle, carefully examined. Its contents ran thus. Dr. Jekyll presents his compliments to Messrs. Maw. He assures them that their last sample is impure and quite useless for the present purpose. In the year 18XX, Dr. J. purchased a somewhat large quantity from Messrs. M., and he now begs them to search with most sedulous care, and should any of the same quality be left, forward it to him at once. Expense is no consideration. The importance of this to Dr. J. can hardly be exaggerated. So far the letter had run composedly enough,
But here, with a sudden splutter of the pen, the writer's emotion had broken loose. "For God's sake, find me some of the old." "This is a strange note," said Mr. Utterson, and then sharply, How do you come to have it open?"
"The man at Mars was main angry, sir. He threw it back to me like so much dirt."
"This is unquestionably the doctor's hand, you know that?"
"I thought it looked like that,"
said the servant, rather sulkily, and then with another voice,
"But what matters hand of right? I seen him."
"Seen him? Well?"
"That's it. It was this way. I came suddenly into the theatre from the garden. It seems he had slipped out to look for this drug, or whatever it is, for the cabinet door was open, and there he was at the far end of the room, digging among the crates. He looked up when I came in, gave a sort of cry, and whipped upstairs into the cabinet. It was but for one moment that I saw him, but the hair stood upon my head like quills. Sir, if that was my master, why had he a mask upon his face? If that was my master, why did he cry out like a rat and run from me? I've served him long enough, and then—"
The man paused and passed his hand over his face. "These are all very strange circumstances," said Mr. Utterson, "but I think I begin to see daylight. Your master, Poole, is plainly seized with one of those maladies that both torture and deform the sufferer. Maladies that hence, for aught I know, the alteration of his voice. Hence the mask and the avoidance of friends. Hence the eagerness to find this drug by means of which the poor soul retains some hope of ultimate recovery. Heaven grant that he not be deceived. There's my explanation. It's sad enough, Poole, aye, and appalling to consider, but it is plain and natural, hangs well together, and delivers us from all exorbitant alarms."
"Sir,"
said the butler, turning to a sort of mottled pallor,
"that thing was not my master, and here's the truth. My master,"
here he looked around him and began to whisper,
"is a tall, fine build of a man, and this was more of a dwarf."
Utterson attempted not to protest.
"Oh, sir, do you think do not know my master after 20 years? Do you think I do not know where his head comes, into the cabinet door, where I saw him every morning of my life? No, sir, that thing in the mask was never Dr. Jekyll. Heaven knows what it was, but it was never Dr. Jekyll, and it is the belief of my heart that there was murder done."
"Poole, if you say that, it will become my duty to make certain. Much as I desire to spare your master's feelings, much as I am puzzled by this note which seems to prove him to be still alive, I shall consider it my duty to break in that door."
"Ah, Mr. Utterson, now you're talking."
"And now comes the second question," resumed Utterson. "Who's going to do it?"
"Why, you and me, sir."
"That's very well said, and whatever comes of it, I shall make it my business to see that you are no loser."
"There's an axe in the theatre, and you might take the kitchen poker for yourself."
The lawyer took that rude but weighty instrument into his hand and balanced it. "Do you know, Poole," he said, looking up, "that you and I are about to place ourselves in a position of some peril?"
"You may say so, sir, indeed."
"It is well, then, that we should be frank," said the other. "We both think more than we have said. Let us make it clean breast. This masked figure that you saw, did you recognize it?"
"Well, sir, it went so quick, and the creature was so doubled up, that I could hardly swear to that,"
was the answer.
"But if you mean was it Mr. Hyde, why, yes, I think it was. You see, it was much of the same largeness, and it had the same quick, light way with it. And then who else could have gotten in by the laboratory door? You have not forgot, sir, at the time of the murder he still had that key with him. But that's not all. I don't know, Mr. Utterson, if you ever met this Mr. Hyde.
Yes, I spoke once with him.
Then you must know as well, as well as the rest of us, that there was something strange about that gentleman, something that gave the man a turn. I don't know rightly how to say it, sir, beyond this, that you felt in your marrow. Something sort of cold and thin.
I own I felt something of what you describe.
Quite so, sir. Well, when that masked thing, like a monkey, jumped from among the chemicals and whipped into the cabinet, it went down my spine like ice. Oh, I know it's not evidence, Mr. Utterson, I'm book-learned enough for that, but a man has his feelings, and I give you my Bible word it was Mr. Hyde.
Aye, my fears incline to the same point. Evil, I fear, founded. Evil was sure to come of, well, that connection. Truly, I believe you. I believe poor Harry is killed, and I believe his murderer, for what purpose heaven alone can tell, is still lurking in his victim's room. Well, let our name be vengeance. Call Bradshaw. The footman came at the summons, very pale and nervous. Put yourself together, Bradshaw. This suspense, I know, it's telling upon all of you. But it is now our intention to make an end of it. Poole here and I are going to force our way into the cabinet. If all is well, my shoulders are broad enough to bear the blame. Meanwhile, lest anything should really be amiss, or any malefactor seek to escape by the back, you and the boy must go round the corner with a pair of good sticks. Take your post at the laboratory door. We give you 10 minutes to get to your stations. As Bradshaw left, the lawyer looked at his watch. And now, Poole, let us get to ours, he said, and taking the poker under his arm, led the way into the yard. The scud had banked over the moon, and it was now quite dark. The wind, which only broke in puffs and draughts into that deep well of building, tossed the light of the candle to and fro about their steps, until they came into the shelter of the theatre, where they sat down silently to wait. London hummed solemnly all around, but nearer at hand the stillness was only broken by the sounds of a footfall moving to and fro along the cabinet floor.
So it will walk all day, sir, whispered Poole. Aye, and the better part of the night. Only when a new sample comes from the chemist there's a bit of a break. Oh, it's an ill conscience that's such an enemy to breast. Oh, sir, there's blood foully shed in every step of it. But hark again, a little closer. Put your heart in your ears, Mr. Utterson. Tell me, is that the doctor's foot?
The steps fell lightly and oddly, with a certain swing, for they all went so slowly. It was different indeed from the heavy creaking tread of Henry Jekyll. Utterson sighed. Is there never anything else? Poole nodded.
Once I heard it weeping.
Weeping? How do you mean? Said the lawyer, conscious of a sudden chill of horror.
Weeping like a woman or a lost soul. I came away with that upon my heart that I could have wept too, I suppose.
But now the 10 minutes drew to an end. Poole disinterred the axe from under a stack of packing straw. The candle was set upon the nearest table to light them to the attack, and they drew near with bated breath to where that patient foot was going, still up and down in the quiet of the night. Jekyll, I demand to see you. He paused a moment, but there came no reply. I give you fair warning, our suspicions are aroused, and I must and shall see you, if not by fair means, then by foul, if not of your consent, then by brute force.
Utterson, for heaven's sake, have mercy.
Ah, that's not Jekyll's voice, it's Hyde's. Down with the door, Poole. Poole swung the axe over his shoulder, and the blow shook the building. The red baize door leapt against the lock and hinges. A dismal screech as of mere animal terror rang from the cabinet. Up went the axe again and again. The panels crashed and frame bounded.
4 times the blow fell, but the wood was tough and the fittings were of excellent workmanship, and it was not until the 5th that the lock burst and the wreck of the door fell inwards on the carpet. The besiegers, appalled by their own riot and the stillness that had succeeded, stood back a little and peered in. There lay the cabinet before their eyes in the quiet lamplight, a good fire glowing and chattering on the hearth, the kettle singing its thin strain, a drawer or 2 open, papers neatly set forth on the business table, and nearer the fire the things laid out for tea. The quietest room, you'd have said, and but for the glazed presses full of chemicals, the most commonplace that night in London. Right in the middle there lay the body of a man, sorely contorted and still twitching. They drew near on tiptoe, turned it on its back, and beheld the face of Edward Hyde. He was dressed in clothes far too large for him, clothes of the doctor's bigness. The cords of his face still moved with a semblance of life, but life was quite gone, and by the crushed file in the hand and the strong smell of kernels that hung upon the air, Utterson knew that he was looking on the body of a self-destroyer. "We've come too late. Whether to save or punish, Hyde has gone to his account, and it only remains for us to find the body of your master." The far greater proportion of the building was occupied by the theatre, which filled almost the whole ground story and was lighted from above, and by the cabinet, which formed an upper story at one end and looked upon the court. A corridor joined the theatre to the door on the by-street, and with this the cabinet communicated separately by a second flight of stairs. There were besides a few dark closets and a spacious cellar. All these they now thoroughly examined. Each closet needed but a glance, for they were all empty, and all, by the dust that fell from their doors, had stood long unopened. The cellar, indeed, was filled with crazy lumber, mostly dating from the times of the surgeon who was Jekyll's predecessor. But even as they opened the door, they were advertised of the uselessness of further search by the fall of a perfect mat of cobweb which had for years sealed up the entrance. Nowhere was there any trace of Henry Jekyll, dead or alive. Poole stamped on the flags of the corridor. He must be buried here." "Or he may have fled," said Utterson, and he turned to examine the door in the by-street. It was locked, and lying nearby on the flags they found the key, already stained with rust. "This doesn't look like use."
"Use? Do you not see it, sir, that it's broken? Much as if a man had stamped on it."
Yes, and the fractures, too, were rusty." The 2 men looked at each other with a scare. "This is beyond me, Poole. Let us go back to the cabinet." They mounted the stairs in silence, and, still with an occasional awestruck glance at the dead body, proceeded more thoroughly to examine the contents of the cabinet. At one table there were traces of chemical work, various measured heaps of some white salt being laid in the glass saucers, as though for an experiment in which the unhappy man had prevented.
"That's the same drug that I was always bringing him,"
said Poole, and even as he spoke, the kettle with a startling noise boiled over. This brought them to the fireside, where the easy chair was drawn cosily up, and the tea things stood ready to the sitter's elbow, the very sugar in the cup. There were several books on a shelf. One lay beside the tea things open, and Utterson was amazed to find a copy of a pious work, for which Jekyll had several times expressed a great esteem, annotated in his own hand with startling blasphemies. Next, in the course of their review of the chamber, the searchers came to the cheval-glass, into whose depths they looked with an involuntary horror. But it was so turned as to show them nothing but the rosy glow playing on the roof, the fire sparkling in 100 repetitions along the glazed front, of the presses, and their own pale and fearful countenances stooping to look in.
"This glass has seen some strange things, sir."
"And certainly none stranger than itself," echoed the lawyer. "For what did Jekyll—" He caught himself up at that word with a start, and then conquering the weakness. What could Jekyll want with it?
You may say that.
Next they turned to the business table. On the desk, among the neat array of papers, a large envelope was uppermost, and bore in the doctor's hand the name of Mr. Utterson. The lawyer unsealed it, and several enclosures fell to the floor. The first was a will drawn in the same eccentric terms as the one which he had returned 6 months ago, to serve as a testament in case of death and as a deed of a gift in case of disappearance, but in place of the name of Edward Hyde, the lawyer, with undescribable amazement, read the name of Gabriel John Utterson. He looked at Poole and then back at the paper, and last of all the dead malefactor, stretched upon the carpet. My head goes round. He's been all these days in possession. He had no cause to like me. He must have raged to see himself displaced. And yet he hasn't destroyed this document. He caught up the next paper. It was a brief note in the doctor's hand, and it was dated at the top. Oh, Poole, he was alive and here this day. He cannot have been disposed of in so short a space. He must still be alive. He must have fled. Then where fled? Why? How? And in what case can we venture to declare this Hyde's actions, well, a suicide? Oh, we must be careful. I foresee that we may yet involve your master in some dire catastrophe.
Why don't you read it, sir?
Because I fear, well, heaven grant I have no cause for it. And with that he brought the paper to his eyes and read as follows. My dear Utterson, when this shall fall into your hands, I shall have disappeared. Under what circumstances I have not the penetration to foresee, but my instinct and all the circumstances of my nameless situation tell me that the end is sure and must be early. Go then and read first the narrative which Lanyon warned me he was to place in your hands. If you care to hear more, turn to the confession of your unworthy and unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll. And there was a third enclosure?
Here, sir,
said Poole, and gave into his hands a considerable packet sealed in several places. The lawyer put it into his pocket. I would say nothing of this paper. If your master has fled or is dead, we may at least save his credit. It's now 10. I must go home and read these documents in quiet. But I shall be back before midnight, when we shall send for the police. They went out, locking the door of the theatre behind them, and Utterson, once more leaving the servants gathered about the fire in the hall, trudged back to his office to read the two narratives in which this mystery was now to be explained. Alright, folks, that's going to be it for Paper Cuts this evening. Rather fittingly, he said he has to leave. It's 10 now in the book, and it's actually 10 my time. Before I go, I simply must plug the Frozen Tundra Finds poll, especially for the folks listening to this as a recording. It's vigorously important that you all go vote there, because it'll decide what games we're playing for the videos on Monday that are replacing Frozen Tundra Finds while I build up a backlog of games. And I really want you guys to, see a game that you want played, rather than just me going, oh yeah, I want to play that one for a long time. It would be, a very pleasant experience if you voted. Anyway, this has been Paper Cuts. I hope it didn't sting.